Welcome back to another episode of Vancouver Real. I am your host today, flying somewhat solo without my younger brother Mike, as he couldn't make it this afternoon. And we do have a full house regardless of that fact. So I'm excited for today's podcast. Today we will be featuring a local, I don't know if we can call you a guru, teacher, salesman potentially. Phil T. Mistlberger is our guest today, and he is the founder of the Samurai Brotherhood, and he's an author of 4 books as well. And I'll get into that a little bit later on the podcast. But first, I have to acknowledge that we are recording out of 70 West Cordova Street here in Gastown, out of Float House. And if you've ever heard of Float House or ever wanted to try floating, head over to www.floathouse.ca, enter the promo code RECOVERY, and that will get you a 20% discount on a single float. And also, I need to give a shout out to Omed over at Omega Point. And Omed is our editor behind the scenes, and he runs a very successful YouTube channel called Omega Point. And he creates all sorts of short inspirational videos featuring guys like Alan Watts, Terrence McKenna, Gabor Mate, just folks like that. So really interesting, inspirational videos. And also shout out to the London Real Academy for supporting us online and listening into the episodes. And we really appreciate it when you guys give us support and share our episodes around, and also give us those reviews and ratings. So we really appreciate it. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest for today. And our guest, as mentioned previously, is Phil T. Mistlberger. And Phil was, he is definitely a leader within our community. And he first popped on my radar, about a year and a half ago now, where several members of our team at Float House were actually involved with the Samurai Brotherhood. And then I kept hearing Phil from other people like Shalina, and he kept popping up online. And there's always this kind of mystery. Who is this Phil Mistlberger behind all these different communities? So I actually emailed your brother, Chris, and he introduced me to Phil on the email, and we met up, had a few sessions, and then I joined the Samurai Brotherhood. And a little more about Phil. Phil actually is an author, as well as creating all the men's groups and the Conscious and Relationship group. He is the author of a Natural Awakening, Three Dangerous Magi, The Rude Awakening, and The Inner Light. So Phil, welcome to Vancouver Real.
Thank you, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So also with us today is the host, or sorry, not the host, my co-host today, but also the captain of the Samurai Brotherhood Blackfish Squad, Nick Solicek. Welcome to be on Vancouver Real as well.
Thank you very much. Awesome to be here.
Awesome. So maybe we could start off today by talking a little bit about the modern men's movement and how it came to be. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting when you tell us about the history and how this whole thing got started. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could start off there.
Sure. You could say that the history began roughly in the late 1960s, early 1970s in Great Britain, and then shortly thereafter in North America. And the history actually had its genesis with what's usually defined as the second wave feminist movement. So there is a connection between the so-called men's movement and the movement to empower women. The first wave of the empowerment of women, generally speaking, is recognized as having occurred in the 1910s, 1920s, when suffrage, when women got the vote, and so forth in many countries. This was sort of put on hold during the First World War years, leading up past that, certainly to Second World War years, the Cold War years of the 1950s, and then made a comeback in the 1960s and 70s. And a lot of it began with the women having the option of the oral contraceptive pill in the 1960s, which enabled them to choose between having a career or raising a family. Mm-hmm. This began the whole process of the empowerment and individualization of women in Western society to a degree, to an extent it never had been done before, apart from that brief revival, that brief moment in the 1920s, the so-called Roaring Twenties, it was called. So at that time, there was a group of men that got together in the 1960s and 70s and decided they wanted to assist the empowerment of women. So they started the first men's groups. They were actually anti-patriarchal men's groups. So they were pro-feminist, anti-patriarchal. So their intent in getting together was to work on the dismantling of the patriarchy from the masculine point of view. And this went on for roughly 10 years or so, and then sometime in the 1970s, some other men, it began to dawn on them that they needed their own form of empowerment. And it wasn't the traditional empowerment, let's say, of subjugating or dominating or controlling the female gender. It was rather about recapturing their own self-esteem through what became generally known as healthy masculine empowerment. And that resulted in two sub-branches of that second movement. The first one was very anti-feminist. It was actually quite reactionary. And it was very pro-traditional masculine domination sort of elements. And from that, I personally believe that one of the branches that sprouted off from that tree was the modern seduction community. Because in the seduction community, although it's mostly about how to manipulate women in certain ways, there is some element hidden within it of reinforcing traditional masculine, say, qualities. Playing the cards close to your chest and this sort of thing, not being overly feminized and giving away your feelings and so forth. The intent was manipulation of women, for the man's positive, enjoyment, gratification of his impulses and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. But there was some elements of traditional, safeguarding or reinforcing traditional masculinity, let's say. The more conscious, as I see it, branch that grew off from that was what was known as the Mythopoetic men's movement. And the Mythopoetic men's movement, something to be understood about this, not every self-help book that's written nowadays about the empowerment of men is actually mythopoetic. A lot of it's just self-help. Some of the stuff that Data's written or so forth is really more in the category of self-help, which is fine in and of itself, but it's not strictly speaking mythopoetic. Mythopoetic had to do with using old myths from the past as metaphors for understanding masculine initiation and empowerment. The two classic ones of those being Iron Hans, which Robert Bly translated and wrote as Iron John, published in 1990, and the other one being the Grail myths of Chrétien de Troyes, who was writing in the 12th century, and all about the tradition of Percival finding the Holy Grail. And Robert Johnson wrote a book about this called He, just one word, He, in 1974. He published this 16 years before Bly's Iron John. And that was sort of the beginning of this tradition of using old myths and bringing them back, revisioning them, and using them as vehicles to understand modern-day dilemmas that men face around being initiated into the masculine. And, of course, the classic one being, and I'll just go over it very briefly here, Percival in the forest, living there in the forest with his mother. And 3 shining knights come into the forest, and he's mesmerized by these shining knights. He says, "Who are you, and what are you doing? What are you looking for?" And they say, "We are shining knights in search of the Holy Grail." And he wants to follow them, but his mother doesn't want to believe the forest. So the reason why she doesn't want to believe is perfectly understandable. She lost her 3 other sons in battle, and she doesn't want to lose her last son. So it's a Saving Private Ryan story. If you remember that Spielberg movie in 1998 was based on that myth, really.
Yes, definitely.
So he makes this agreement with his mother that she will let him leave and go off in search of the Holy Grail, become a Knight of the Round Table, under one condition, and the one condition is that he will always treat women well. And that is the birth of the Code of Chivalry, the Knight's Code of Chivalry. The rough equivalent with the samurai was Bushido, how to comport yourself properly as an honorable warrior, let's say. Now, that was all perfectly good and valid, but there is a dysfunctional aspect of that. We can get into this, as we go forward here. A dysfunctional aspect with modern men is being too nice, right? And being too much of a savior, too much of a white knight, and having a poor connection with the father. Because you notice in that Holy Grail myth of Percival, there's no father parent in the story. He's just living with his mother in the forest. And so it is also symbolic of the fact that every man, when he comes into empowerment, has to go through an initiation. And that initiation often involves breaking the bonds with his mother in some way. He has to break away from the mother in some way. Not as a way, obviously, of disrespecting her or disenfranchising her or turning against her, but in terms of not living his life based on constantly needing the approval of women, stemming from being a mother's boy, constantly needing the approval of his mother. So for many men, it's not so much about the relationship with the feminine that's the problem. The problem is lacking male initiation figures, older men. That's what the three knights in the forest represent. They're initiating Percival. He then goes on to become the Knight of the Round Table, and he finds the Holy Grail. And Robert Bligh's Iron John myth is similar, although the details are different.
Right.
So that was the history of the whole modern men's mythopoetic movement, and I personally got involved with it in 1992 when I did a large weekend workshop for men with 250 men in a gymnasium. It was very interesting, 48 hours for me. And I'll just say real briefly that when I got into that, at the time I was in my early 30s, and I had doubts about the usefulness for me because I had been seeking in India. I had studied in monasteries. I was a disciple of a famous Indian guru for many years, and my search was always for the transpersonal or the transcendent, beyond polarities. So I said to myself, what do I need a men's group for? But I knew there was some value in it for me, and as I got involved in it, I realized how much I could heal elements of my own history, let's say, and primarily, in my case, my own relationship with my father. Like many men of my generation, baby boomers generation, I was emotionally more allied with my mother than my father because he was off, and they were off in factories and offices. They weren't available in the Industrial Revolution, the rebuilding the world after the world wars and what have you. So that was interesting to see. I spent 1 year on a men's group at that time, and with 6 or 7 guys that I never thought I'd have much in common with, but we ended up being really bonded with each other. When I left after 1 year, I was surprised at the amount of emotion I felt. So I was a trained counselor already at that point, so in subsequent years I began starting my own men's groups, running my own men's groups. And various times rebooted the men's community over the years, depending on how available I was or whether I was teaching in Europe, which I was doing a lot of, or writing books. And we started up this most recent version a year and a half ago, and Nick was one of the few guys I started it with. We had just a handful of guys, and right now we've built it to somewhere around 55 to 60 men in a year and a half. So it's been gratifying to see that response.
Definitely. I think it's a much needed part of men's lives, especially here in the city in Vancouver. For whatever reason, we see that a lot of men lack that personal strength or fortitude for whatever reason. Maybe because, you talk about how so many men have been raised by mothers. They didn't have that initiation into relationships with men in their lives because their fathers are off working half the time, right? So it's kind of created a lot of dysfunction in the modern man. And I was wondering if you can go into a little bit why that happens.
Well, there's an idea from psychoanalysis which explains this kind of well. I mean, you don't have to be a big believer in psychoanalysis to see the common sense of this idea. And the idea is that when children are growing up, they're closer to the mother than the father. Men and women have one thing in common. Males and females have one thing in common. We come from the body of the mother. So there's always that very close bond there. And it is natural for a boy or a girl to be closer to the mother. But at a certain point in time, something happens to little boys, roughly between the ages of 6 and 12, coming into puberty. It starts to dawn on them that their mother's a different gender than them. She's a girl and he's a boy. And so he begins a process of differentiating from his mother, establishing himself as a masculine identity in relation to his mother. But the person who's supposed to really help him at that point is his father or older male figures to initiate him into his masculine experience, let's say. But if the father's not there, or if the mentoring presence is not very strong. He's tired from work, he's falling asleep in front of the TV, or he's not very interested in his kids, or he's just not present physically or emotionally, what have you, then the boy ends up being overly dependent on the mother. And so he grows up being divided in his perception of women. He sees them on the one hand, they're either goddesses to be worshipped and adored, or they're whores to be fucked, which becomes the whole part of the whole pornography industry, right?
Yep.
So he has this split in yogic language between his heart chakra and his sex chakra, and he can't join the two. So he's spineless with women that he adores and loves, and then he secretly regards the great group of other women as objects for his gratification, sexual objects and nothing else.
Yeah.
And so the problem there is that he can't figure that out so much in his relating to women. It's like, as we sometimes say, filling up the Grand Canyon with a spoon. It's an endless task.
Yeah.
And it's not the fault of the woman. It's that there's something missing from his development, and that's the connection with the masculine. And so if he can't get that from the father, what he can get that from is the community of elders. But again, the problem with so many in our modern times is that there's that disconnect between generations. I mean, there was in my generation too, as there is in current generations. And so men have other men in their lives, but they're often just peers, men of similar age. And so there's that competitive element that's always running in the background. And so one of my intentions in forming this brotherhood was to have, this different generations present, some older men with some younger men, so that, as I often say, the greatest gift an older guy can give a younger guy is curiosity about him, interest in who he is.
Right, being around that old man energy, because that is something that a lot of us haven't had, to be honest, and we haven't had that kind of indoctrination or a proper introduction into manhood. I know oftentimes you've spoken about how important it is to almost go through a rite of passage of sorts, into manhood, and a lot of us just don't get that anymore. And this is something that is really being cultivated in our men's group, and I'm sure you guys have seen that. More so in the guys who have been with the original Monday night group, who were there for over a year plus now, and we're seeing changes now. Like Nick and I are seeing changes in the Blackfish squad in the men just in maybe 3 months' time from being involved with that group. We're seeing guys that are definitely finding their own sense of empowerment, and we're seeing actual changes in their behavior and their confidence. A couple guys come to mind, obviously, that have really standed out, but. I think it's an amazing thing that's much needed in the city. And there is an obvious drive towards this kind of work. And there's different men's groups operating in the city right now in different capacities. But what we're doing with Samurai Brotherhood is definitely, in my mind, kind of the most healing and therapeutic of what's going on.
The vision was always, particular from the beginning, which is that I didn't want just a community of, strictly speaking, a support group for men. I mean, that's certainly an element of it. Support group factor is an element of it, as you know from the meetings. But the reason it was called Samurai was it's drawing from the best elements of the warrior cultures of the past to bring in some of that. Let's say some of the old school, to combine with the more humanistic approach of being emotionally supportive of each other. So that's an important part of it, but we can't go too far in that direction. Otherwise, we lose our backbone, so to speak. And from your experience in leading the squad, co-leading with Andy, what is involved in terms of the importance of bringing the element of fire into meetings and challenging other men, right? Like that's what differentiates a strong group from just simply a support group that is maybe not all that committed. Is you're holding each other accountable, holding each other's feet to the fire, right? That there's something to answer to every week, and that is the initiation. So the initiation is not some exotic experience in some weekend workshop. That sometimes gets lampooned as weekend warriors, right? So we're striving to be more than weekend warriors. The initiation is in the commitment of our relationships with each other. So if a guy does a weekend workshop and has some kind of exceptional experience, he goes away, and after a while it just becomes some trophy on his bookcase that he can brag about. And then even that, it fades in time. It's a much stronger approach is to, certainly workshops are important, but is to integrate this into your daily life in terms of being committed to the men in your life. Like, what does it mean to have sustained, committed relationships with the men in your life? That's the initiation.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people are doing a range of personal growth work. Could be a weekend workshop, could be a week, could be a day, could be a couple hours a week. They might be working with a counselor one-on-one. And I didn't know what I was going to get out of the men's work. Like, even when you suggested it to me, I've been working with you for 4 years, and I thought, okay, men's group, this could be interesting, right? Based on your experiences you shared with me, I thought, I might be able to get something out of this. But until I actually went to the meeting, started connecting with the other guys, and there was this sense of accountability and integrity that I didn't see anywhere else in my group circles or at work or in personal relationships. This, I call it a snowball, starts to get momentum, but it's really like fire on the belly. And I think that we have that every week in the Tuesday group. And you do see the changes in guys. At the same time, without that commitment without showing up there, these workshops, these one-day one-offs where they go learn something, doesn't always get integrated, right? It gets sort of washed in with everything else.
Precisely. Right. And you know what the reason why you're able to do this and why you've had success in captaining a group of men is that you have challenged them, right? You do hold them accountable, right? They know that there's something, they're going to meet up with something if they're not following through on their word. So it's the first code of our 14-point code is make your word count, right?
Yeah.
It's so important for men. That's what defines our masculinity in many ways is following through on things, like Gillette's idea of king, warrior, magician, lover, 4 primary archetypes of the masculine, right? That important one being the king, which is the ability to complete something, to stick with it, right? And I think you've been showing that, right? Which is why it's been you've been getting a positive response, and what you guys have done together, holding a group of 22 guys together for 4 or 5 months. You've been doing this now is tremendous, given the fact that this is the first time you've been doing this.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yes, and you're getting that response because you're holding men answerable with consequences if their commitment is not present, right? And that's the part that's so often missing in our society.
I think, Andy, you've done a ton of personal growth yourself. You work with T. You've done world-class leadership trainings and a range of other things I probably haven't even heard about. And you know, just like I do, how hard it is when you say you want to change your life, you say you want to do this thing or you want to quit this habit, you want to change your relationships. How hard it is to, on a daily basis, hold yourself accountable when there's so many distractions and things going on in the world, right?
Absolutely, and that really touches a little bit what T was mentioning around how if you do go to a weekend workshop or seminar, that is, again, becomes a trophy on your wall, but being involved with the Samurai Brotherhood is you have that group of accountability going on all week long. We have guys checking in with each other on Facebook on a daily basis. If there's a guy in a group that needs support in some way, half the group is texting him and checking and making sure he's doing all right. So it is that really nice continuity into your life and having that constant source of accountability, which is really great with the men's group. And we're definitely seeing that now. And we're seeing a lot of movement, and we're seeing guys sticking around, and which is a huge accomplishment in anything in the city, is to get a group of guys committed to do something and staying there, which is huge. And a lot of it is because, all of it is because of the vision that you had for us and the training you're giving us, overseeing the entire Samurai Brotherhood, right? I'm wondering, what kind of factors what are at play inside of a men's group, the different kind of elements at play that are really going to help and benefit men in their lives?
Well, everything you were just saying gets translated into a man's life. That's the whole idea. So if we are living two lives, let's say, if we're living our life in community or in our meetings and living a completely different life outside that is not reflecting the values or the lessons that a man is living, that is learning in his group meetings, it's not really working. The idea is for it to translate into your life. So what actually are the lessons we're learning? It's much like in school, right? There's certain grounding, you get certain lessons, one of which is that commitment factor and the continuity, the stick-with-itness, as I call it, the staying in the game, seeing it to its completion. See it to the end. It's a great line in that Field of Dreams movie where he says, build it and he will come. He referring to the Father, but it actually becomes sort of like a they will come. Others will respond if you build it. And the other one was see it to the finish, see it to the end, complete it. These are just really important things. So we talk about this in the meetings, but again, it has no power if it doesn't translate into a guy's life.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I have no interest in creating a church or a closed community that looks good on the inside, but it doesn't translate into what the guy's doing in his life on the outside. The purpose of the Brotherhood is to help men get their life in order.
Definitely. Yeah, and those two things you touched on, the accountability factor, just being able to follow through and finish a task to the end, I find is lacking in a lot of people these days. And just the idea of keeping your word. Like, those things are such basic principles and ideas. For whatever reason, they're falling through the cracks in a lot of cases. Would you agree with that one?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, we live in the time of what I call the 21st century distracted man syndrome, right? Which is So much information that is accessible now just by looking into your phone, which does everything for you now except serve you coffee.
Yeah.
So in some ways, the advanced technology has made us weaker because we don't have to make specific efforts to get things done. That doesn't have to be the case, but in many cases it is. There's a saying in Zen Buddhism, Zen is character. What it means is that it's not having the big, flashy experiences of life that matters. What matters is developing the character. And the character is all about that follow through. Like it's character that ultimately results in things getting accomplished in life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like in the experience of these groups, these weekly groups, these guys are showing up. You're asking about commenting on what's going on there, what's taking place that's maybe facilitating some accountability in these guys' lives. T used the term church there. He said he's not creating a church. In some ways, I would also still call this space sacred. I use the word unique more than I do sacred because guys are getting together and having a conversation, talking with each other about their lives. We're running experiential exercises and giving them topics to discuss. But the point is there's no women there. There's no booze. There's no snacks. There's no television, right? This isn't a bar. And they're given an opportunity to actually share in a space where they're supported and they feel comfortable to talk about real things that are going on for them.
Absolutely. And that's another very rare part. Typically in male bonding, there's usually an activity associated with it, a sporting event, going to a bar or whatever it happens to be. And it's very rare to have a group of men who actually sit around and go this deep together as a group of men. And I'm curious, as I'm still fairly new to the group relatively, how it's going to start showing up. So what can you typically expect to see change-wise in, what are the things you're going to see from a guy who enters into a men's group and the development that he gets along the way? What do you typically see in that?
Well, a classic result tends to be, and again, I have to speak in generalities here, so this is not going to apply to all individual cases, but a classic result tends to be he starts doing better in his relationships with women. And the reason being is that he's not overly sourcing from women for his approval and for his validation. So he doesn't need this constant look at me and how great I'm doing sort of reflection from women all the time. His batteries are getting charged in his meetings with the men to some extent, depending again on how well he shows up, right? Doesn't show up very much in the meetings. He doesn't get a whole lot of battery charge. If he really shows up, he's going to feel his batteries quite charged. Mm-hmm. He then takes that charge into his life that gives him that extra energy. And women tend to be very sensitive to energy. They're very good at detecting whether a man is present in his body or not when he's with them. And so when he's charged in his energy, he tends to be more present with her, which tends to satisfy her in certain ways, let's say, more often than if he was weak in energy or distracted or something else. So without even firing a shot, so to speak, without even saying anything, he's automatically doing better in his relationships with women. This is one of the ways in which it translates. It can also translate into his appreciating his father more because he's hearing more of the masculine perspective. When guys get together, 10 or 20 guys in a meeting for 3 hours once a week, and they hear stories. And a lot of these stories they're hearing broadens their perspective. They suddenly realize, wait a minute, I'm not the only one who's got this going on. And when it broadens their perspective, it tends to give them a greater appreciation of their father. Because what marks a man growing up, one of the things that marks a man growing up is he stops regarding his father as just his father. He sees him, he'll always be his dad and his father, but he also sees him as a man who has his own struggles, his own imperfections, and was doing the very best he could given the limitations that he had. All that is aided by the process of having his perspective and context expanded by listening to other men talk every week in the meetings.
Yeah, you talk a lot about healing a relationship with the father and how important that is for men. What are some of the typical dysfunctions you see in men who have poor relationships with their father? Maybe he was absent, maybe he had a very short fuse and an anger, or maybe he was abusive. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things you'll see in a man that was raised in that kind of environment?
Well, usually he's not a very contented man. That's not to mean that suggests that necessarily he won't be successful. That is true in a lot of cases. I don't know. I don't have statistics here, but I'd be willing to bet that many men who had a very, let's say, unhealed relationship with their father don't do all that well in work. But there are cases where they do. There are cases where there are self-made men that were very unhealed with their father, and they still established themselves in the world, and they still really went for it. But what often happen in the cases of those men, my experience with those men is that even if they're materially successful in the world, they're often very malcontented at other levels because they never had the certain validation around who they were, a basic validation of their self-worth. And so they may become very good, let's say, at controlling women, or what I call spell casting, using their charm and charisma to cast spells on women. But this tends to be a little bit of like Mephistopheles making a deal with the devil. It's a short-term benefit and a long-term loss. So he pays the grocer's bill later on in life, and he finds that he's burned out, or his woman leaves him, or he's overworking too much, or hey, let's call it the Brad Pitt syndrome. Since he just broke up with Angelina Jolie recently, he joined, in a romantic relationship with her when they had no children, and then over a period of 10 years, they ended up with a whole flock of 6 kids, and suddenly he's fallen off the radar. This is a popular story, so to speak. We don't know details, but it's a pretty good metaphor for what a lot of men go through. They find themselves taxed and burnt out and no longer having any energy inside of them, so they start overreacting, behaving badly, losing their ability to temper their emotions or what have you because their batteries are not being charged. Again, because of the lack of their masculine core being validated at an earlier part in their life or in their present time relationships with other men.
Right. So how does the male relationship to his father, the man's relationship to a father, begin improving because of these men's groups? How does that actually happen? What's the process there?
Well, because he starts transferring some of his resentment that he has. Let's say in the case of a typical modern guy who is not particularly close to his father, doesn't appreciate him very much, carries resentment. My father didn't do enough for me in some ways, let's say. He starts sharing that wound in his circle in certain ways through his sharing of himself or listening to other men and their stories. And so some of the wound gets transferred through his process with the other men in his meetings, right?
So the transference happens between the men in the group.
That's right.
Yeah.
From the process with his father, a lot of it gets transferred to the other men in the circle. Now, there's a term in psychotherapy called transference, which happens when a patient or a client sees a doctor or a psychologist or a counselor or a coach or what have you, and it starts projecting parental qualities onto the guide figure. And this has to be worked with therapeutically. And there's countertransference when the therapist projects onto the client. That does happen, and it also happens in groups. It happens, you've seen, I'm sure you've noticed this yourself as leaders of groups, that some guys look at you in a different light when you're a leader, right? And that's normal, and that can be worked with in a healthy fashion, but you do have to be alert as to what's going on there. And when it's worked with in a healthy fashion, the guy's wounds with his father begin to be, transferred to the group setting, and then they can be processed out in a conscious fashion, ideally. At which point he notices that some of his resentment to his father's come down. But there's a little more appreciation for who his dad is.
Right. So that's how that transference happens. That's how that
in an ideal fashion.
The indirect healing of the relationship with the father through other men.
That's right.
That's right. Now, let's say, for example, he's been in the men's group for 3 months, 6 months, up to a year, whatever. Now, what do you see in terms of the shift? What will you see in terms of him carrying that out into the world when he does heal that relationship with his father?
Well, there's always the two wings of the bird of transformation, right? There's insight and there's behavior. So the insight is what you get when you meditate. Insight is what you get when you do therapy. Insight is what you get when you participate in transformational groups like our men's groups. But in and of itself, insight is not enough. You have to make it work. Like insight is like, you could say, like the gas you put into the engine, and then you have to turn the ignition to make the whole thing work, right?
Yeah.
So that's behavior. That's the second part. And behavior is only really tested out there in the world. It's not really tested in the meetings. To some extent, how you comport yourself in meetings and the way you show up and so forth is important. But what really matters is what are you doing out there in the world in between meetings, right? And that's where behavior comes in. So the famous, Einstein bumper sticker saying the definition of insanity is do the same thing over and over again, expect a different result.
Yeah.
So what men have to do is to learn how to behave differently. So what we say is, can you be different while everyone else is being the same? Can you be different while everyone else is being the same? Because you can't expect people to change. They usually won't, certainly not in a way that will conform to your expectations. But that doesn't mean you can't be different. That doesn't mean you can't be impeccable. The Buddha's words, dying words on his deathbed, work out your salvation with diligence, be a light unto yourself. In other words, be impeccable. That's, in some ways, that's the highest teaching for men's groups as well, is to be impeccable. It means to give it your best shot. So in your life, in the world, outside of the meetings, are you giving it your best shot? That's the behavior part, right? So that's crucial. And that's why, in the meetings we have this thing, what did you do the last 2 weeks? Did you live up to your assignment, right? Out there in the world.
Yeah, and guys show up sometimes and they didn't, right? They didn't follow through on the things that they said they were going to do, the goals that they said were important to them, things they committed to. So sometimes guys feel pressured that they've got to say something in the group just to, then they go home and they sit on the couch and eat a bag of chips or, whatever, watch TV and tune out. And I think that that's always surprising to me when I see guys so lit up about something that they want to change, and then a week later, half-assed it, they got 50% done or nothing at all.
Well, where does that show up? And we, without naming names, we've seen that in some characters in our some of the men in our group, and one in particular who, recently decided to leave, right?
Yeah.
And that was a guy who he was, not essentially keeping his word and not doing the things he said he wanted to do. And now, where is that going to show up in, his normal life? And that could be for anybody, not just for any individual in the group. It could be for anybody.
Well, a few weeks ago, we talked about Gurdjieff's teaching. He calls it the absence of unity, right? That within every man, there's essentially multiple personalities with multiple agendas happening at the same time. So I gave an example, right? A guy goes to yoga classes, transcending his ego and taking care of himself and healing, and then he goes home and does some drugs or drinks all night or jerks off to porn for 4 hours, and right, it's totally misaligned. You have all of these different things running within you, and this is what people are up against if they really want to transform and change.
Yeah, I agree, and they got to stick with it. That's the main thing too. It's dropping in for a month isn't going to do it. It's got to be a consistent thing, a consistent practice, and having that bonding with other men, like you mentioned so much. One thing that you've mentioned in the past as well that I thought was really interesting is the idea of being around old man energy and why that's important for young men. And you actually have said in the past how men who typically aren't exposed to old man energy become somewhat conspiratorial or mistrusting of old men. Can you maybe explain a little bit of what goes on there?
Sure. Bly and Iron John referred to this as Zeus Energy. And it's sort of, it was his way of saying the right use of power, let's say. Because one pretty much indisputable fact is that this world throughout history has largely been run by older men. They inhabit most of the power positions in the world. I mean, there are the odd Mark Zuckerbergs around who become extraordinarily successful at a very young age. There are the odd nations here and there that are run by a woman, but for the most part, it's been older men that have run the world for a longer time. So the problem is if a younger guy is alienated from his father and from an old man energy, he tends to be mistrustful. So he tends to perceive the world in a conspiratorial light. He's always suspicious of the powers that be that are doing things behind his back, whether it's, who caused 9/11 or did the Americans really land on the moon or what's being sprayed over your head. It's always about some greater authoritarian figure that's sticking it to you, that's doing it to you. And so it's often fueled by a psychological wound around authority issues. So another purpose of men's work is for men to connect in a little bit more in a tribal way with older men. Often that means purging their wounds, exposing their wounds around their anger, their resentment, and so forth. But then coming to a place where they can actually hear and be understood received by older men in a way that's non-judgmental. And then this can translate into a different relationship with his own personal power. Because when a guy is too concerned with what authority is doing to him, he tends to never step into his own power because it's very difficult to become something that you hate. It's very difficult to become like something that you hate. So, for example, if you resent successful people, it's very difficult to become successful yourself. If you resent people that have established some power in the world in terms of their success level, it's going to be difficult for you to become that yourself because all your energy is being wasted in resentment, and subconsciously you're saying to yourself, I don't want to be like that person. I don't want to be like my father. I don't want to be like that asshole over here. You know, I don't want to be like Donald Trump or whatever character you want to pin your projections onto. And it becomes a cop-out, an excuse for not stepping into your own power. So men's work, it's another element that men's work addresses, is to really expose the ways in which we men can cop out and blame forces around them for not stepping into their own power.
Excellent. I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about you and your history. And, one thing I'm curious, because, you've been leading these groups for a while. You seem to be called to this type of work. And I'm wondering what it is that really drives you and motivates you to continue on and to create these groups and help men along in their journey.
Well, I have a passionate interest in this. Part of it stems from my own family of origin, my own particular past, and all the nuances and details with what drove me, to seek for that, let's say, light at the end of the tunnel, or for truth, or to come in contact with mentors. But what I can tell you in a very simple, direct way is you look at the state of affairs on the planet right now, and look at something like, say, extremism, or terrorism, which is not a phenomenon limited to, say, Muslim radicals, but was also done by, say, warrior cultures of the past. For example, the kamikazes in World War II, in the Japanese fighters. But what you have going on now is a lot of alienation within modern men, and because they can get information so easily through the internet, there's so many ways in which they can act out their shadow side without being conscious of it or actually healing it or embodying it. And so there's a tremendous danger in the time in which we live. We're very vulnerable to radical acts of crazy, young, angry men. And when I see this being done, it's a weekly occurrence. You read it, you see it every day in the news, daily. Yeah. And whenever I see these things being done, I always feel an anger inside of me, and the anger is, yes, it's partly directed at the guy who's doing this, but it's also at the things that lack in our modern culture, the weak connection between old man energy and young man energy. So old men were supposed to, in a tribal sense, we're supposed to initiate younger men in certain ways that made them feel part of belonging to something, part of a community. But when that's not there, the younger guy seeks his identity in some other way, and he's going to do one of two things. He's going to seek to identify with a negative cause, or he seeks to gain attention in some other way by acting out. Now, most guys don't go into a mall and shoot up a bunch of people, but they might act out by behaving badly with certain individuals in their life, for example, in ways that are self-destructive towards themselves because they're seeking attention, right? Or they identify with a very negative cause outside of themselves. And there's a lot of that going on the planet right now, and not all of it is known about openly. It's a lot more about it's sort of hidden or concealed.
So kind of like the shadow side of humanity, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, can we talk a little bit about anger? Because in this destructive conversation, guys in society acting out, right? Doing destructive things to themselves, to other people, sometimes in extremely violent ways. In your work, and my experience with you, anger has been a very important conversation in terms of channeling that, using it creatively and not for destructive purposes. Can you maybe explain a little bit how anger, what the relationship is like with anger in society? Like, for me, I see this being a very taboo subject. If you get angry at home, at the family dinner, you fear of being alienated or cast out or sort of shunned, right, from the circle.
Well, men traditionally have been, volatile in certain ways, and here I'm going to generalize a little bit more, but generally speaking, I would say that women feel more than men. Their feeling meter is on a lot of the time. They're processing or aware of feelings. We men, not so much. But when men do feel, they tend to be more intense than women. They often are explosive in their intensity, and that's the problem. Men have this capacity to switch off or on in a very intense fashion, be either completely absent by switching off, or to be very destructive and explosive by switching on. And so there is a real need there for men to develop the consciousness to understand their own shadow side, because the shadow side of the hunter or the warrior, as you know, is very dark. It's sometimes described as a junkyard dog. It can be a very, very intimidating thing. And so where's the outlet for that going to be, right? That's the problem. There is no outlet for it, or it's done through the gaming culture. Modern day online life, gaming culture is actually, there are some studies around this that it may even be having an effect on the brain in some way, in that men are less creative now because they seek their creative impulses channeled through a gaming culture instead, where the rules of the game are sort of defined for them and they just have to express themselves in this sort of a fashion. So what's happening to their creative spirit? Is it being engaged? And in many cases, it's not. It's atrophying. So there are ways in which we have to work with the energy of anger by converting it. This is alchemy, right? These stages of alchemy where you have to separate your emotions and see them clearly and then recombine them and bring them back again. But men need that awareness, and that's why that second code in our 14-point code is know thyself. Socratic language, the unexamined life is not worth living. Men need to be aware of the darker side of their nature in order to understand it and work with the energies of it properly. When a man sees his anger clearly, it's not that his anger is going to necessarily go away, but it becomes the rocket fuel that takes him in his life to places where he can go successfully. All the most successful men usually have plenty of anger. They just have a right relationship with their anger.
Right. So you're speaking now a little bit about shadow work in particular, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of those signs for men that they can actually start identifying those shadows that are running in the background that they might not even be aware of right now?
Well, for a lot of men, it often shows up as a kind of a depression. So psychologically, yes, biochemically, depression is pretty much related to imbalances in the brain, but psychologically it's often related to a denial of anger or suppression of anger or repression of anger. And when anger turns against the self, it becomes self-esteem begins to be diminished, and the self-worth starts to go down. And this leads to a resigned attitude towards life, which then can lead to clinical depression. There are many men in that boat who are very disconnected because they have no outlet for this primal part of their nature, and to give voice to it. So it's another thing, that where the men's community comes in, where the circles, the meetings come in, that you can actually be heard in this way. If you're angry, or if you have powerful feelings of hatred or contempt and so forth, that this is a safe place to share it, that you can actually let this stuff out. And the mere act of it being heard by others in a community setting is enough to begin that process of the man recognizing that he's not guilty for being who he is, which begins the process of transforming his self-loathing. So his self-esteem starts to come up. And a man who's feeling better about himself is much less inclined to be reactive or angry. A man who doesn't feel good about himself can be very explosive.
Right.
Or he shuts off completely and becomes resigned and depressed.
So that's how the shadow shows up. And so that, if there's a guy out there who is experiencing those kind of symptoms, it could all stem from his unhealed anger, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like not being conscious of it enough.
Yeah.
Like there are many men who don't even know how angry they are. And so they have ways of narcotizing it away. Narcotizing it is a term I sometimes use for deadening pain. So why is it that people do drugs for the most part? Let's say different from the plant culture, which is more of a shamanic thing, engaging with plant teachers. But let's say typical recreational drugs, any kind of drug is involved in is the need for dissociate from pain. I don't want to feel pain, right? Or alcohol. Alcohol suppresses fear. Nicotine suppresses anger. Pot suppresses sadness. So they all suppress emotional functions that enable us to disconnect from our pain. And the problem is when a man is not cognizant or not in touch with his pain, he can't actually take the step towards transforming it. First step is always reversing denial. Like in AA, man stands up, says his name, I'm an alcoholic, right? Reversing denial is always the first step. Same thing here. So first we need to recognize we have anger, recognize we have pain, jealousy, fear, and then we can begin the process of converting that energy.
Right. Yeah, well, there's a lot of guys out there, I think, that have a need for this kind of thing, and we will be having an open house. And what was the date for the open house again?
October 11th.
October 11th. We will be having open house. I don't think we have a location set out yet, but we will create an invite on Facebook, and we'll definitely post it up on the Vancouver Real page and invite anybody you want out to it. Any man, that is, of course.
And our retreat is October 7 to 9.
And the retreat's coming up on October 7th to 9th, yes.
Maple Ridge, and we still have spots for a few more men for that.
That's excellent. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of guys out there that are looking for this kind of work, and we definitely have spots to fill. You know, there's 3 other squads that are accepting men right now.
We have, just for the sake of anyone listening, so, you know, you made reference to Blackfish squads, so they know what we're talking about. We have 4 squads, Blackfish, Wolf, Crow, and Titans, and another one will be forming soon. And nice. So we are not just a community of men that are developing relationships with each other. We're also a community of men that is training leaders. And you two being prime examples, you've done a great job with the Blackfish Squad. And, I want to acknowledge both of you openly for that.
Thank you.
And, your commitment to this process has been palpable, and the results have been excellent. And it's just the beginning of what we're creating here, as the other 3 squads are also doing very well too. So.
Definitely. I really like the leadership training aspect that Nick and I are really benefiting from right now. Just in terms of defining leadership, in your mind, what really defines a strong leader?
Well, there's no question. It's the passion and the commitment that go into it, right? So to be a leader in anything in life, you don't have, skills are important. Obviously, you need some skill set. Charisma is very useful, very helpful. But here again, what really brings skill and what really brings charisma? It's interesting to look at that. Skill comes from hard work, developing work ethic causes you to develop skills if you apply your work ethic. And charisma, the definition of charisma is the ability to hold the attention of other people, right? So what we call an interesting person is somebody who can hold attention. And the only way you can hold attention is by fully showing up. So again, all these sort of standard personal growth cliches, they kick in at this point: to show up, to be in your body, to be present, to be passionate about what you're talking about, immediately engages the other person. They wake up and say, this person's serious. They really know their stuff. They're interesting to listen to. That's what a charismatic person is, right? And that kind of person can hold the attention of one person, 2 people, or 5 or 10 or even more. So the key thing for leadership is the ability to hold the attention of other people. But you can only hold the attention of other people if you are passionate, if you're talking about something of substance, if you know your stuff, and if you present it in such a way that is convincing. You speak with conviction, then people want to listen. So it's a lot of qualities that are part and parcel of your own personal growth and development that translate in such a fashion that others are going to sit up and notice you and say, hey, this person knows their stuff and they believe in it, so I want to listen to them.
Yeah, and one thing I want to say is I'm acknowledging Nick for really stepping up as a leader within that group. And we talked about this a little bit off air. I'm not sure if you want me to say it, but you're also experiencing success in other areas of your life. And I'm wondering if it's kind of correlating with this new leadership role that you're developing within Samurai. And now it's actually it's happening for you in your real life, in your work.
Well, there's no hiding when you lead your own group. So you're there speaking with guys, you're supporting them, you're facilitating an experience, and ultimately I have to show up there every week on my game. And so when they commit to things, I get energy from that as well, because this group has come together to transform, right? To improve their lives. I want to be better people, better men. And all the guys are working on different things, different aspects of themselves, just like I am. So I know that I get a lot of energy from the group on a weekly basis. I think about the group when I'm not there. I'll be at work, I'll be making breakfast, I'll be out for a run, and I'm thinking about them. I get a lot of energy from it. It actually really excites me. The guys have a cold shower routine right now that they use. They're waking up in the morning and they get into, freezing cold shower for a minute, 2 minutes. And I joked the other day, it's the first time in my life where I get in the shower, I'm thinking about 20 guys. But yeah. It's true. Like, it's just an amazing experience. And I think that has transcended into my work, my personal relationships, because to show up in a room every week, speak with 20 guys and have maybe a plan or some agenda for the evening set out, you've got to believe in yourself a little bit, and you've got to step up to the plate to deliver on that.
Yeah, and you've definitely, I imagine you developed quite a bit. I mean, you were one of the original ones from the Samurai Brotherhood, and now you've gone through the process and working with T, and now you're leading your own squad. And it's I'm sure you feel very proud about that. And I could see the passion actually when you lead in the group. You really do care about it. You really care about the group, and you really believe in the work. It's really great to watch.
I love it. It didn't happen overnight. I started working with T 4 years ago. Actually, the anniversary of my first workshop with him will be in about a month. And so I've done a lot of work to get myself to this point where I feel comfortable facilitating this kind of conversation. And it feels really good because I always had questions and was always seeking something. And I think now that I have a better, stronger sense of myself, clearer vision for my life, it feels amazing. It's really like, I love it.
Well, one thing I really like about it too is how you've given yourself permission. You know, you've just, no one's going to hand you the keys and say, okay, you're good enough now to go accomplish whatever you want in your life. No one's going to say, and say you're okay. You can go ahead and do whatever you want to do.
Right.
You're empowering yourself, which I think is huge.
Yeah. I think I've had a lot of things running, right? Working with T, having him shout at me in some of his weekly meetings has been really, helpful to get in touch with my anger. I think that I have used pot, alcohol, many other things to suppress particular emotions in myself. And how can I work on those things when I'm distracted, when I'm using porn as a substitute for a relationship with a real person, right? Using marijuana because I'm frustrated with my situation, right? Resenting people that are successful, saying I don't want to be like my father. He was a salesman his whole life, right? And going another path. I went and played poker, did a whole bunch of other types of jobs, got into music management and event promotion. And now here I am, just turned 30, and I'm in sales. And I love it. I'm actually having an awesome time. And so there's part of me that I can't deny that is much like my father, has many of his qualities. And it feels really wonderful to be able to integrate that, still work on other things that are important to me, like the men's work.
It's one of the great keys in masculine development is to recognize that you're not that much different from your father. You're distinct and you're a unique personality. In some ways, your personality can be very different, and men need to establish their own individuality. But when you really start to see the bigger picture, and this happens, sometimes it takes a few more years of life to see it. You can see the ways in which you're really not that much different from your father or your other family members, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah,
it doesn't. The whole point is that you see it as not a bad thing, rather than, oh my God, I don't want to be like them.
Right.
There's something healing in that. I also want to just briefly throw out the samurai factor, because we've talked a lot about the therapeutic aspect of the groups. Just briefly in our last few minutes here.
For sure.
The samurai part of the Brotherhood was chosen because that is emblematic of warrior virtues and qualities that are in a lot of the old warrior cultures, but samurai was a good one. Certainly there's Knights Templar, Mongols, the Saracens, and the the samurai and the Shaolin monks and so forth. There are many really interesting warrior cultures in the past. And what I always endeavored to do here was to extract the best qualities of them. And with samurai, the three ones that we focus on are the what are traditionally considered the three virtues of the samurai, which were courage, forward gear in life, loyalty. And loyalty here is to be understood as loyalty to principles or a cause, not necessarily loyalty to a personality or a group, although that can get in there, but it's more loyalty to the principle or the causes. And the third one being creativity. So the idea of the samurai monk, samurai warrior playing his flute or writing haiku poetry. So this is what completes the man and makes him, a full-bodied, masculine expression. So courage, loyalty to principles or causes, and creativity, working with his anger and his creative force, his sexual energy, and all of that in a way that is creative. Really important to remember those three principles. And so we seek to use that also as the principles of the Brotherhood. So it's more than just a circle of men supporting each other therapeutically. It's also men striving to embody those warrior principles in their life.
Absolutely. And also, on a side note, you do run a conscious relationships class as well. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Just briefly in passing, I also coach and work with a lot of women and have for many years. And so I run relationship trainings for men and women, which draw on some of the tantric teachings and a lot of group therapy and dynamics of how to make relationships work. So that's certainly always been a huge part of my work. The other thing I'll just mention here briefly also about the Brotherhood is the ninja section we have.
Oh, yes.
Which is we have a martial arts section, and we do require men to be in one of the weekly meetings first before they join that martial arts section. So we do have that physical element, and we have occasional Wolverine meetings, which are fun, competitive meetings where we go outside and just be very physical with each other.
And last Wolverine was such a blast. I don't think I've been that sore in a long time. I don't, you don't think it's gonna be that bad. Do a little wrestling and play some soccer, rip shoes off other guys' feet. However, at the next day I woke up, I could barely move. I was like, what the hell happened? But that's what they called the Wolverine, I guess.
Right.
Well, we get a healthy sense of our competition there, which is great.
Right.
So one of the last things I'll say is samuraibrotherhood.com. You can find us there. We're on Facebook. My name's Nick Solacek. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to Phil. You can reach out to Andy. If you are successful and there's certain particular aspects of your life that you want support on, come and talk to us. If you're struggling and there are things that you're dealing with, you feel like there's no one you can talk to, come and see us. There's a community of guys that feels the same way, didn't have a space, didn't have a circle, didn't have a support network. And we found it, and we're here.
Absolutely.
And the 14-point code of the Conscious Warrior is right there on the website, samuraibrotherhood.com. We also have an affiliate in the UK run by Sean Redmond. And so if men know anyone, it's in Wigan, which is in Lancashire, northern England. If anyone know anyone in England that are seeking support, Great Britain, we have that community there as well.
And we might just have that. We have quite a few listeners over in the London area because we're affiliate with London Real Podcast. So
there you go.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us today on Vancouver Real. Nick, thank you for joining as well.
Thank you.
And we're going to go take a little break, have some dinner, and actually go to the men's meeting right now, which is going to be a lot of fun. Every week is a new adventure, and you never know what's going to come up. So it's amazing work, and I encourage anybody out there in the community who wants to get involved with it, samuraibrotherhood.com, contact myself, Nick, Phil, and we'll get you all set up. So thanks for joining us on the podcast if you made it this far. And if you like what you heard today, give us a review and a rating on iTunes, YouTube, and Stitcher. That really helps us boost our rankings up. And until next time, to whatever is.